we're talking about my biggest podcasting screw-ups on this episode of Contrabase Conversations. Welcome back to another episode of Contrabase Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I want to thank you, as always, for tuning in. Subscribe to the podcast, share us on social media, and drop us a line, feedback at contrabaseconversations.com. I'd love to hear from you. And you can get all the details about everything we're up to on our website, contrabaseconversations.com. And today's a follow-up episode to the 7 lessons I've learned interviewing. I thought a few months ago it would be interesting to get out my thoughts and perspectives and lessons that I've learned about this whole podcasting thing that I've been doing for a decade now, and trying to make jazzier titles than The Technology Behind Podcasting, The Interviewing Skills Behind Podcasting. So today, instead of calling it what I was originally going to call it, Podcasting Technology, I decided to call it My Biggest Podcasting Screw-Ups, which is more or less what this is about, although there's some technical know-how in this, hopefully, as well. So for both the blog and the podcast, I've always taken the stance of making things as good as I possibly can and then putting them out without apology. There are so many podcasts out there that you tune into. You hear about an interesting show and you tune in. What do you hear? You hear the host going on and on. Oh, I'm so sorry that this episode's late this week. Oh, I have a cold. I don't feel good. The audio's a little off in this. I'm really sorry about that. And there's nothing that makes a worse first impression, in my opinion here, than starting off by apologizing for yourself. It drives me crazy, and I resolved to not apologize for anything that I put out. But today, I'm letting loose, and I'm going to tell you all the stuff that I've struggled with or wish that I could apologize for if that wasn't my stance over the years. These are all these elements that I've found out kind of the hard way, technology-wise, in podcasting. So, starting out, getting ready to launch in 2006, I researched what the available technology was, and I came up with a few bits of hardware to purchase and a few pieces of software. And by the way, I've written a blog post that touches on everything that we're talking about here today. So you can go to the website, contrabaseconversations.com, and there's a link to the blog post, and it has audio examples from different episodes that I'm talking about here. So if you want to get some details in front of your eyes, just check out the show notes and you'll get the link. But I started out with an iRiver, this little MP3 precursor to the iPod. I think it came out before the iPod, but it was right around the same time as the first iPod. What I loved about the iRiver is that it would record as well as just play back. You know, something that podcasters in the mid-2000s were using for portable podcasting solution. I also had these 2 Sony microphones that I had actually bought for recording auditions and recording myself back when mini discs were a thing. Do you remember mini discs? People who are over 30 or over 35 maybe, those mini disc players were all the rage in the 90s, and I don't even know, who knows what happened to that mini disc player, and all my mini discs lost to the ages. But I had these 2 Sony microphones that I don't know why I had 2, but I did have 2. And I had a Griffin iMic. This is a USB interface. You can plug an 1/8" jack microphone, like the iPhone headphones, just typical headphone connector. You could plug that in. So you could plug a microphone that had that kind of connector in it, and it would go into your computer. And I also had a headphone splitter in case I was using 2 microphones. And I had this terrible piece of garbage Acer laptop. I think half the laptop was made up of fans. So you do anything remotely strenuous and all these fans would kick on, and you could watch the battery life go down if you just stared at it for a few seconds. In terms of software in the early days, I was doing everything in Audacity, which honestly, Audacity is a great piece of software. I still use it for a lot of things today. I have a lot of options, but I'm so used to it. I've done so many things in it. and it's great for editing audio. It's great for mixing episodes together. Levelator is a piece of software. I'll talk more about that in a second. It's free, and it's kind of a normalizer, compressor piece of software. And then I was using Skype, which I use to this day for recording interviews, and iTunes actually to convert the WAV files to MP3s and to add what are called ID3 tags. It's all the information on the file, so it's not just some random file sitting on your computer when you download it. So my early workflow, I would plug in one of these Sony microphones into the iRiver and record as a WAV file. Then I'd plug the iRiver into my laptop and I'd transfer over the file. I'd then use Levelator, that piece of software, to balance everything out. So it uses an algorithm to make all the voices on a podcast more or less the same volume. And it works on my own dialogue as well. And I got in the habit of using it for everything I would record for a podcast in terms of dialogue. So I'd import my dialogue into Audacity after I levelated it, and then I'd mix it with my intro and my outro music. Now, one downside to using Levelator is that it brings out any sort of background noise in a recording as well. And this became a big problem for me early on, but more on that in a second. So for live recordings, I would plug both of my Sony microphones into the iRiver using just a plain old headphone splitter. Now, had I known better, I would have had my guest hold a mic and I would have held a mic, or at the very least gotten them on a table really close to the guest. That was a big mistake on my part, because what happened was, in addition to capturing the voice, I was getting all the room noise and the ambiance. And to make the interview audible, I'd have to jack up the volume and run it through Levelator, and that also boosted all that room noise. So it made this pretty obnoxious background noise you can hear in a lot of my early episodes. So a couple of my episodes early on, or the interviews, were so rough just in terms of noise that I finally ended up buying a piece of software called SoundSoap. It's not cheap. It's about $100, but it's a great plugin. And I still use it to this day. I've certainly got my money's worth out of it. I think I use a little bit of SoundSoap on everything. But at a certain point, you just can't clean up bad audio. And if you apply too much of this plugin, it starts to sound incredibly weird. You start to turn people into robots. It sounds like they're distant. It's very strange. But it did help with some of those early recordings. So, lesson learned, use microphones that people are holding, or use lavalier microphones, and put a pop filter on those microphones so that you don't get all the P's and those sort of sounds popping out. Just get them close to you, get them close to your guest. And if I had a few problems with my live interviews, I had even more with my Skype interviews in a few critical ways. I did all this reading about the importance of recording off of your computer, not relying on a piece of software on the computer alone. Because if the computer crashes and you're recording on it, you might lose everything. So recording to an external device gives you a backup. And I've got a link in the show notes to a great article about this. It gives you more details. And thinking back on it, I can't even remember exactly what I did in terms of external setup. But I remember it involved all these pieces of gear, and I would sit and just stare at that heap of gear every time I recorded, trying to remember what connected to what. Now, it did not, however I set it up, it did not produce great results. And its biggest problem, and I don't know how on earth I didn't notice this, was that my dialogue and my guest's dialogue would slowly slip out of sync with each other. So I would start talking over them before they finished their thought. And it got worse the longer we recorded it, and a lot of these episodes are long. So with some of the older episodes, it sounds like I'm an insane person. My guest is speaking, and all of a sudden I start this crazy laughter, and then my guest says something funny, and there's dead silence. Super awkward. So I did my best to clean up these sync issues, but at a certain point, there's just nothing you can do. Luckily, I ended up bailing on that hardware setup and moved over to just recording on the computer. You're taking a little bit of a chance just doing that. You might lose the interview, but it's never happened to me. I did mess up a couple of interviews in kind of comical fashion, but more on that later. Also, these Sony microphones that I was using are condenser microphones, which are not great for the type of thing I'm trying to do, where I'm talking in a suboptimal environment. I'm usually podcasting in my kitchen, no matter where I've lived. I've lived a lot of places and done podcasts in a lot of different places, and I always end up in the kitchen. Who knows why? But it's a terrible space for recording with condenser mics, because you catch every reflection of sound, and that adds a lot of background noise. And finally, these audio problems got a lot better thanks to a gift from my wife of a Zoom H2. I love Zoom. It's a great company. They make these wonderful microphone portable recorders. They have the H2, H4, H6, and I currently use the Zoom H6, which is not cheap. It's, I think, $400, but it is a fantastic piece of gear. I'll talk about it in a minute. But the Zoom H2, which you can still find to this day, it was the best thing that ever happened to me audio-wise. It's so simple, it's small, portable, and it got rid of a lot of the background noise issues that I was dealing with. And it also allowed me to plug right into my computer and just record directly into the computer using the device's high-quality USB mic. So I didn't have to record on the iRiver and then transfer over, and I didn't like that, I didn't do it again, and that sort of thing. So let me record right into Audacity, which felt so much more natural. After doing it 1 or 2 episodes, I just couldn't even imagine going back, and it saved a ton of time. Then this was also around the time that I moved over from my lovely Acer laptop to my first MacBook. And that was an upgrade in all sorts of ways. I ended up actually moving over to GarageBand. And honestly, I don't know if anything improved moving to GarageBand. I think that it's a more attractive interface than Audacity probably, but I was so comfortable with the workflow in Audacity that I think the podcast actually suffered a little bit audio-wise, probably in only ways that I would notice, but I didn't know exactly how to manipulate audio in it in a great way. Finally, I got comfortable in GarageBand, and I ended up using that until I retired, I guess is the word I'll use, for those several years. This is also right around the time that I started to get really busy in life. Not that I wasn't already busy, but I took in the fall of 2009 a high school teaching job in the Chicago suburbs, and my free time dropped down probably to 10% of what it had been. So I was still scheduling interviews when I could, but my mind just was not in the game. I was moving on to this new career. I was focused on that. I was focused on conducting. I was focused on improving as a orchestra teacher. Such a different world than the bass teaching I've been doing for so many years. And so I think that the few dozen podcasts before my retirement suffered in quality, and is mainly due to me just not really focusing enough on the whole endeavor. And I was looking for any way to cut time out of the podcasting process. And I'm not sure why I did this. I wish I hadn't, but I started just calling someone on my iPhone rather than going through Skype and all that business, and turning the speakerphone function on the iPhone and putting the speaker right up against the Zoom, and I would speak into the other side of the Zoom. And it worked, but it did not sound good. It sounded even worse than a bad cell phone connection. And unfortunately, a lot of really great interviews, not a ton, but the last in the 120 to 150 something range, a lot of them were recorded that way. And it's funny, if you look back, speaking of the busy thing, if you look back at when the podcast started to drop off, you can pinpoint directly when I started teaching high school, which is September 2009. And the weekly podcasts started to become bi-weekly and monthly. And then when I felt like doing it, which became every couple months, and then nothing for years. And the reason why, I'll just tell you, is the time involved in podcasting. So doing a podcast the way I like to do it takes a fair amount of time. And I think the least amount of time I can spend on a standard interview podcast, not like this podcast where I am just turning the mic on and yakking, but one of the standard interview podcasts, I think the least amount of time I can take is 10 hours. And that's because there are just a lot of steps in podcast production. If you really think about it, you've got to research the guest, schedule the interview, do the interview, edit the interview, think about what you want to say in the intro and the outro, compile any listener feedback, any news, record your own dialogue, mix in music, mix the whole podcast together, master it, level it out, convert it to an MP3, write the show notes, create an image, upload the podcast, write a blog post, and promote the episode. And it might even be more like 15 or 20 hours for a complicated one, but I think 10 is the minimum. Doing something like today is a lot less time, but it's still at least a couple hours, probably more than that. And if I was to go real super bare bones, I could probably get it down to an hour for a 20, 30-minute show, but that would just be dumping the raw file online and doing nothing else. And that leads into the next thing I want to talk about, which is editing. And this is a tricky subject. And I have changed my mind, gone back and forth so many times over the years about editing. And I'll tell you, I wish I could put things out and not edit. I really do. It would save so much time. And I do edit myself a bit when I go through, but it's really for the guest. I would be totally fine with putting myself out 100% unedited. That's at this point, it's fine. I've got no qualms about that. But there are two big reasons that I do edit. And one is for my guest. And I've found that telling my guest that I do edit takes a lot of pressure off of them. It alleviates the pressure that they have to say everything exactly perfectly. And it makes more of what I think of as a safe environment. It allows us to talk about whatever we want, and it might end up in the episode or might not. No big deal. And I know a lot of podcasts don't edit, but a lot of the people that I have on, this might be their first interview, or they probably don't do a lot of interviews anyway. And so it's just not a normal experience. And being able to tighten it up and really polish it, I think just helps the overall experience for them. And the second big reason is for all of you, the listeners. And I know that a lot of the circular kind of speech patterns that we have with the ums and the ahs and restating things, the brain kind of filters out a lot of that. But I'll tell you, I cut out 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, maybe even more out of a 45-minute interview of ums, ahs, you knows, pauses, misstatements. I think sometimes I'll interview someone for an hour and I'll only have 40 minutes after I cut. It can be that drastic. And I look at my download numbers and I look at some of these older episodes that are over 20,000 downloads, and I multiply those minutes I cut out by the 20,000. And I just feel like I'm doing a good thing for the universe by cutting all of that out. It's just a lot of time that I'm not having people sit there. The content is just tightened up. It just feels like the right thing to do. So editing is a burden, but I'm continuing to do it. And you got to be careful with editing. It's easy to go too far when editing, and you can make people sound like these strange, fast-talking robots, especially if someone's kind of a slower, more contemplative kind of speaker. If you take out all the long pauses, their delivery becomes incredibly weird. So editing is an art, and I'm starting to get better at it, or I'm continually getting better at it, hopefully. And it's just something that I decided is a necessary evil. And I actually use it as an opportunity to take notes on what we talked about. And that helps me with the pre-podcast, the show notes and that sort of thing. But it also helps me with these new series projects like Winning the Audition, because it gives me a chance to timestamp everything that we talk about. So there are 2 podcast episodes, 2 interviews that I messed up. And I figure, I don't think I've ever mentioned either of these things in public, but here we go. So I put out a podcast recently with bass luthier Nick Lloyd. And what I didn't mention is that I had actually interviewed Nick several years ago. And this was in my retirement, and I had done it on my work computer, and I changed jobs, and I handed that work computer's laptop back in, and I had just forgotten that the interview was on that laptop, and I had made no backup. And I was so mortified that I just didn't even know what to do. And shamefully, I guess I'll tell this in public, I never let Nick know. I never told Nick. It's just that we did an interview and then it never happened. And I got the podcast going again. And I'm promoting everything, and then I'm Facebook friends with Nick, and I get a message saying, "Hey, where's that interview we did?" And I sent a very apologetic message, and he graciously scheduled a new interview with me, and we talked again, and it was all good. But oh man, that was embarrassing on my part. I just chalk it up to being in a different phase in my life. I just was not even remotely. I don't even know if I remember my password to log into the website at that point. So that was one. The other one was, again, right before I disappeared for forever, with Charlie DeRamus. Now, Charlie sounds great, and I love Charlie. Such a great guy. It's episode 158. Now, what happened was, and I hadn't been doing interviews a lot, and all these nitty-gritty details I forget if I don't continually refresh my memory. And I don't know what went on, but I had his audio. It was great, but my dialogue, my side of the conversation was gone. It was just gone. And to make matters worse, I recorded it and then I didn't look at it for a while. So this was like maybe weeks after I did the interview. I listened and I realized, oh, I have no questions. So I reconstructed what I think I talked to Charlie about. And I re-recorded all of my questions, which, if you were kind of not in the podcasting rhythm anyway, reconstructing something like that does not make you want to do more podcasts. Let me tell you that. And the results are, Charlie, again, sounds great. I sound like I'm either on something or I'm incredibly depressed. Like, our energy levels are so hilariously different. Charlie's up and he's excited, and I sound like the saddest thing that's ever happened to a person happened to me. So very strange listening for sure. And in that blog post, you can listen to that or just go back to the archives. It's 158. So a little bit about my thought process as I was getting the podcast going again. I rebooted it in the fall of 2015, but I wanted to make a commitment to myself. If I was going to do it, I was going to do it. I was going to be committed to a weekly release schedule. None of this when I feel like it every whenever number of weeks or months. So I scheduled an interview in October of 2015 with Alex Hanna. We recorded it, but I didn't release it for a little while. Sat on it, thought about what I wanted to do, and I decided I'd put that episode out. That'd be a good way to come back. And then I would alternate for at least a little while new interviews with rebroadcasts of some of the older podcasts. And so I did that. I put out Alex, then I put out Dave Moore, and kept that up for a few weeks. And this seemed achievable because what it really was I was just doing an every other week show and then doing a rebroadcast. And it was just important for me to create a schedule that I could stick with. And that was the first time I'd even thought about podcasting, or at least doing a podcast, in quite some time. I think that I had moved 4 times since the last time I really did the podcast regularly, and I'd switched jobs 3 times. So even finding my gear was a challenge. In fact, I recorded that Alex episode, I think, on my iPad using a lightning port microphone, and I recorded my dialogue just on my iPhone and transferred it over to the computer. A few episodes in, I was using this microphone that I had from school, this Blue Snowball, which I do not recommend for podcasting, by the way. Maybe for interview with somebody else, it could be okay, but not for your own dialogue. It picks up all the background noise, lots of hiss, not good. I finally bought an Audio-Technica ATR 2100. Love that microphone. It's a great all-in-one microphone. If you want to do a podcast, get that. It's not great to record yourself, by the way. If you want to get a good microphone to record your instrumental playing, that's not good. The microphone sounds terrible as soon as you get off of it, but it's really built for close mic podcasting, and it's great. It doesn't pick up the background noise, sounds very professional. It's both USB and XLR, so you can start off plugging it into your computer, and as you start to get a more advanced setup, you can plug it into a mixer. So it's a good long-term solution, a mic that you can upgrade. And I lost my little Zoom H2 somewhere along the way. I'm so sad about that. It's probably sitting in the cabinet of one of the many schools that I taught at, and I just left it, moving from one job to another, I guess. So I decided that I was committed to doing something weekly, and I started to do that, and momentum started to build. I fixed some things that made it easier to find the old episodes, put out the app, and as I got back into doing interviews, I remembered why I love doing interviews, and I started to schedule more of them, and eventually, after a couple of months, switched over to what I'm doing now, which is 2 podcasts a week, and I did that just to get them all out to the world. And I did hesitate for a few days thinking about moving to a more than once a week model. Very hesitant to do that. I thought, would I run out of people to talk with? And I looked at my list and I realized I could do, no kidding, a podcast every single day for the rest of my life. I would never run out of people. And that's people I never talked to. It's great to have people back too. There's no limit to the number of people. This could be once a day easily. Now, in terms of long-term, I may not keep up the 2 podcast a week model. I might, or maybe I'd go more. I could do a 5 days a week podcast. I could do 2 interview shows. I could do an all music show. I could rebroadcast an old thing. I could do a Q&A episode. There are so many things you can do with a podcast. And that's the beautiful thing about podcasting. The model is extremely flexible and you can morph over time into different formats. Now, in terms of gear, here's what I'm using these days. I got back into podcasting and I started to make some new purchases. And here's what I'm using these days. I'm using the Zoom H6, which is a beast of a device. Love it. It's not cheap, $400, but it has 4 XLR inputs. You can plug in 4 professional quality mics. It also has this mic capsule it attaches that allows you to record another stereo channel. And those all record to separate tracks, which is a fantastic thing as a podcaster. So that's kind of my core piece of hardware for recording now. And that's my audio interface for my computer. I then have 2 Shure SM58s, the good old, you can throw them at a brick wall and they'll be fine, rock concert standard microphones. They're about $100 each. And then I've got a MacBook Pro. I walked into the Apple store this spring, realizing I was getting back into this, and I essentially said, what is the most powerful 13-inch MacBook I can get? And they said, we can absolutely hook you up with that. And I have it, and that was a good upgrade. I restarted the podcast on a MacBook Air, one of those little 12 or 11-inch MacBook Airs. Nice little computer, but pretty small screen to work on and pretty underpowered, even for editing audio. And then in terms of software, I'm using Skype. I'm using FaceTime sometimes for interviews. I use this great little piece of software called Ecamm Call Recorder. And I am a weird guy in terms of editing these days. I actually use Ableton Live, which is, it's a great piece of audio editing software. It's usually thought of as a piece of software you use for DJing or for electronic music. And I actually got into it when I taught electronic music. And I just know the software so well. I know how to do everything in it. And it's the best piece of audio editing or audio software in general that I own. I own the full version. So why not use the best thing I have? It blows GarageBand out of the water. And I also know it so well. It's like second nature to me. So I got the idea of using the Shure microphones and the Zoom for doing live interviews from Tim Ferriss. And he does that, and it's a great setup. These mics will last. I'll probably be dead, and these mics will still be working. And I give my guest a mic. I hold a mic that eliminates the background noise and makes for a much cleaner podcast. And again, check out the blog post that goes with this episode, and I've got links to all of these different examples. But Katie Ernst, the jazz vocalist and bassist, she was the first one I did an interview with using this setup, and it sounds great. Sounds totally professional. So wrapping up here today, my overall philosophy with interview podcasts is get the interview. Now, in an ideal world, I would be interviewing everybody here at my place in San Francisco. We'd be hanging out. We'd be each holding one of the mics. We'd be chilling, it'd be relaxed, we'd be drinking coffee or whatever. But this in reality happens maybe 1 in 20. The rest of the time, I'm just trying to get the best interview I can using the methods that I'm going to be able to use for that interview. So if we go in order of best to worst method, the best method would be what I just described, which is in person, each of us holding a microphone. Second best would be over Skype or FaceTime. Third best would be landline. And coming in last would be cell phone. Now, my number one priority, again, is to get the interview. So if I have a computer-savvy guest and they use Skype and they are comfortable with that, we'll use that. Heck yes, absolutely. But I'd rather have the guest comfortable and talking with me rather than struggling to figure out how to use Skype or download Skype. And a lot of my guests, it's just not a question that really works for me to ask. Okay, I need you to do this, install this, and you have a microphone and put on headphones and all that. I'd rather have a great cell phone conversation than a scattered, confused Skype conversation. And if you're interested in learning more about the tech and a little bit more how-to kind of information, this is a little more thoughts and observations and things I've learned about the technology of podcasting. If you like a how-to, I did this series for ArtsHacker. I've got links to it. You can just check out in the show notes. But I did a 3-part series about how to do a podcast. Part 1 is hardware, part 2 is software, part 3 is distribution. And that'll tell you everything of what I would actually recommend someone did. And I don't share all these personal anecdotes and that sort of thing in there. I keep a little more nuts and bolts. So check that out if you're interested. And thank you for listening to this. I've been thinking about doing this for a while. I realize it's not one of the normal type of episodes, but I thought that for the percentage of people that would find this interesting, they'd really dig just hearing an honest reflection on my experiences with a decade of working through all this kind of technological stuff. So thank you for following along, and we'll see you again in a few days for more life in the low end of the spectrum.